Hey everyone, my name is Tarang, and I'm the Startup Ecosystem Development Manager at AWS Nordic's team. And my mission is to help startups grow, scale, and become successful. Today, I'm going to talk about a topic that's close to my heart: what makes a startup successful, and with an angle to uniqueness about the Nordic and Baltic ecosystem. For the purpose of this keynote, we will consider an exit outcome of a startup as a success. Why this topic is close to my heart? Obviously, it's the focus of my job, but more importantly, it gives me immense pleasure to help other entrepreneurs because I've been one myself. And one thing that I learned from my experience as an entrepreneur is that you never stop learning. A bit about my background. I started my career out at sea working on a large cargo ship. And I traveled to 40 different countries and worked from a very, very young age within a multinational environment. After giving up my sea boots, I worked within the transport and logistics industry with enterprises like AP Moller Maersk, which is a Danish shipping company. And I worked with British Petroleum, or rather now known as BP, and finally transitioned into more of a techie role within the last decade, working with an independent software vendor based out of Norway. And finally, I started up my own venture. But here I am now with Amazon Web Services. So it's been a great journey so far. I've been mostly been in the customer-facing role, and I'm truly passionate about listening to customers' problems and pain points, and solving those. I love to make complex and complicated things simpler. That's my motto. So, what do most startups have in common? And the answer is they usually fail. Only a minority of startups who beat the odds and survive, they share a number of traits. As per a Harvard Business School study, almost 75% of venture-backed startups fail. And we will talk about some of those traits with the context of the regional culture and economy, etc., of course. However, let's first look at what are the top reasons of why startups fail. I must point out that this is not an exhaustive list, but rather a consolidated analysis from different sources. And the focus over here was on the company level reasons of failure. One of the most common traits across all these reasons is some level of leadership failure. I will not go in detail of all the reasons listed here, but rather focus on the most important and probably one of the most critical criteria for investors when they're evaluating a potential investment, and that is the team. Not having a right team almost always leads to a failure, and most of the other reasons are either directly or indirectly linked to the team. But what exactly do we mean by the right team? Is it the experience of the founders, technical skills, soft skills, their business acumen, how well they can sell, or their common vision for the business and a shared purpose to change the world for better? Well, the answer is yes, all of those. When you look at any startup that has turned into a successful business, it almost always had an experienced and skilled team with an unshakable belief in both themselves and their venture. This naturally brings us to the next slide as to what are the success factors and what differentiates a successful startup from others. These are picked from a study from e-commerce genome by Compass in their startup report, which looked at almost 650 startups. What you will observe that almost all these factors are related to the team. Of course, it goes without saying that you need to have a product market fit, a market potential, funding, a good business model, and so on. But if there's a right team, it can pull together all of it and it can make it happen. So the bottom line is, and I always like this quote from one of the mentors that I met, is that product is not a startup. Rather, startup is your product, at least in the eyes of an investor. And just like a great product needs a great product team, a successful startup needs an awesome founding team. To make this topic a bit more interesting, let's compare United States, which is a well-established and mature startup ecosystem, with Europe. And if you were to measure success through the unicorn lens, Europe produces more than 1/3 of global startups, but only 14% unicorns. Now, this data is a bit old, but the dynamics may have shifted a bit in the last couple of years. But there is a long way to close this gap. Historically, Europe's ecosystem has been less effective than that of the United States at turning startups into late-stage successes. And European startups are rather 30% less likely to progress from seed to a successful outcome. For example, securing a late-stage Series C funding or beyond and going public or being sold and acquired and so on, as compared to the startups that raised seed funding during that time in the United States. However, that doesn't mean that Europe's startups are outright failures. Of course not. In fact, as measured by bankruptcy rates across the rounds, European companies don't fail more often than US companies. In fact, European companies are more likely to stall after a fundraising round, meaning they simply don't advance to the next stage of funding or don't manage a successful exit in the form of an IPO or some sort of acquisition. And one may naturally ask, why is that? And there are three key differences between the European versus US startups that I'd like to point out. And that could attribute to why European startups don't reach that stage as compared to the United States startups. And the first one is, of course, the ability to raise money. Other than in the United States, most startup environments struggle with either limited or very diffuse funding options. Despite the rise of crowdfunding and pre-sales, and Europe has many strong players in seed and early stage funding, but it's not blessed by access to really growth stage funding. Even though there are certain hubs, of course, like London, Tel Aviv, and Berlin that has presence of investors to support high growth stage startups, going abroad, or rather going to the United States, is still the best option, as the US ecosystem and market can really nurture growing startups into global players. And the second reason is the focus of getting revenue first versus growth. Now, as opposed to US, where a single market penetration is needed to gain a competitive advantage, growth is always the main focus. Growing big and growing fast is the motto. And with less later stage funding available, European startups cannot spend massively on growth, but they need to generate revenue earlier in order to stay alive, of course. Now, there are exceptions to this rule, but what I'm talking about here is a little bit more on the generic approach and the mindset differences between the two regions. Last but not the least, the go-to-market strategy. Now, in Europe, you have to go and capture different markets within Europe, which are very, very different from each other. Whereas in the United States, you have to conquer one large, massive market. And to make matters worse, in the European markets, you have to translate the products to several languages. You have to establish many different partnerships with different countries. And the growth is, because of that, naturally bottlenecked. So where do Nordic and Baltic startups and ecosystems stand? The Nordic region has made significant contribution to the global startup ecosystem, and billions have been invested into Scandinavian startups. More generally speaking, the ecosystem has a lot of strengths and a lot to offer, and a few weaknesses, of course, that can be seen from this chart. But let's go a little bit into specific strengths and weaknesses of the startups in the ecosystem in this region. So let's look at the top strengths of the Nordic and Baltic region. Starting with the strengths, the public sector provides a strong framework for the ecosystem, including efficient e-governance, a streamlined bureaucracy, plentiful of opportunities to start a business, and a strong focus on innovation. Well, the Nordic ecosystem has its homegrown network of investors too. And they have poured an increasing amount of capital into the region's startups. Especially at early stage, there are a lot of opportunities to access funding through innovation grants, startup loans, accelerators and incubators, and there is a strong business angel network in the region. And lastly, the willingness of the consumers as well as the businesses to adopt new technology. Digitalization agenda being on the forefront makes it easier for startups to have early adopters for their products and get to the product market fit phase relatively fast. Now, looking at the weaknesses on the right-hand side, the first one is pretty obvious, is the conservative approach, and that can sometimes be an hindrance. Most successful startups have a big vision and are ambitious to grow fast and grow big. Someone once told me to remember that a small Coca-Cola bottle in the US is a big Coca-Cola bottle in the Europe. Now, that analogy is specifically related to investors and investment. Whether it's for raising capital, going to market, or hiring, the Nordics are still generally lacking in having an international mindset. And lastly, there is a talent deficit in the region. Not really in the terms of quality. I think the whole ecosystem and education system produces a lot of young talent here. In terms of quantity, though, it cannot meet the demand. So it's difficult to build a large tech team locally, especially. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. And that is, my 2 cents and tips for the young and upcoming startups in the Nordics and the Baltics. Well, my first advice and the tip is think global from day one and have a plan to go global, at least. A well thought out strategy and an execution plan will go a long way and not only help to set the right vision, but also make you stand out to potential investors who are looking to invest in your venture and your vision. Number 2 is to build a remote and international team. Instead of spending a lot of time, effort, and money in trying to hire locally instead. Number 3, be bold and collaborate with people both in the local ecosystem, but also outside. Finding right connections early, whether it's mentors, investors, employees, as well as strategic partners, is key to success of your business. Number 4, tell a powerful and consistent story. great founders can tell great stories and convince everyone around them to be truly aligned with them and believe in their vision and plan. And last, and most important, if not equally, is to go and execute that plan and strategy. Execution is the king, as we've all heard, and strategy is as much about plan as its execution. The plan really means nothing if the team cannot execute it. So it's that's why I said it's one of the most important. And I would like to thank you all for listening to me, and hopefully this gave you some food for thought. I would like to tell you that if you need any sort of help, more advice, access to resources, whether it's technical or business, please do not hesitate to contact your local business development manager for startups at AWS. And one more thing before I end my presentation is that we have a summit for the EMEA region coming up on June 9th and 10th. I would urge you to attend this. We will share a lot of interesting stories about successful startups, and there'll be a lot of advice and resources available to you during this summit. So go on AWS website and register for it. Thank you, and have a great day and week ahead.